Hey there, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our Sourcery 101 webinar talking about how to properly cite other people's work and other people's ideas in your writing. This is something that we know well. It comes across in our work with students on their academic writing, as well as sometimes in college counseling when students get themselves into hot water at school, often unknowingly, because they think they're citing right, but not so fast. And then problems arise. So we're here to help you out and to help make this process easier. So without further ado, as people are queuing in, I'll introduce myself and then a quick introduction of our leading panelists. I'm going to actually moderate today, and Katie and Tania will be taking over. And my name is Bari Norman from Expert Admissions. I'm the head counselor. And we have Katie McIntyre and Tania Asnes, two of our writing specialists who will be leading today. If we could just, before we officially get started, we would love to get a sense out there of what grade level people are in. So if you could let us know. So we have a sense of how to adjust our stuff. Okay, it looks like we have mostly 11th graders from what we get here. So thank you. All right, so let's get started. I will pass the mic on over. If you have questions, we're happy to answer them as we go. Please put them in the Q&A, not in the chat if you can, and I'll moderate and keep an eye on those if anything comes up.
Great. I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Katie, a writing specialist with Expert Admissions. My background is in college writing centers and in philosophy. And Tania, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Tania. I'm a writing specialist. My background is also in college writing centers, and I've been with Expert Admissions. Well, you're an Expert Admissions person too, but I've been with Expert Admissions for something like 6 or 7 years. I don't know, but working with students in different capacities as a writing specialist. So anyway, here we are. Hello.
So yeah, we wanted to do a webinar on working with sources because I think there is a lot of anxiety around this question of, am I citing correctly? Am I not citing correctly? But there's also a whole conversation to be had about the most effective way to use sources in your own writing, to get your point across, to really have a conversation with other scholars. And I think that conversation too often gets overlooked. So we're going to speak with you today about not just how to write with sources, but also how to think with sources. So I'm going to pull up
While you're pulling things up, I wanted to add that I think sometimes that students think that, well, a couple of things. There's this idea of authority. You know, sometimes students will feel like, I don't have the authority to make such a strong statement or argument. You know, who am I to kind of say something so, you know, boldly or straightforwardly? Or, you know, the idea that if you see an idea and maybe it's something you've thought of before on your own or not, a perspective or, you know, a thing that you noticed in the text, and then when you're reading something about it, you see it. And there can be this question of it, like, well, I thought of it, but now here it is. And how do I navigate that and manage it? And of course, when you see or read something in someone else's words, it can often be difficult, of course, unintentionally, but it can sometimes be difficult to kind of revert back to your own way of saying things. And so this can be much trickier than it seems like on the surface. And so we hope that this is helpful for those of you where that sounds familiar.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. We will talk about some strategies for disentangling your ideas from what you're using the text for, as well as how to phrase things in your own words. So the brief overview, we will talk first about how to think with sources. Before you even begin the writing process, you should be engaging with sources. It's not that you start your essay and then go look for a quotation somewhere to support what you're saying. You should be thinking about other people's ideas or the, your primary text that you've been asked to write about from the very beginning. And then we'll talk about how you actually get those sources into your writing. And of course, the anxiety producing question, to cite or not to cite.
And if your instinctive reaction to that question is, don't you always cite? Mostly, but not every time. So we'll explain that later on.
That's right. Okay, so let's get started. There are many different ways to engage in conversation with a source. Two of the most common that we see in high school writing in particular, we're highlighting here. So one way to use a source is to engage with its argument, right? So you use a source for argumentation when you engage directly with its claims. You might agree or disagree with those claims, or you might refine or qualify a claim to make it your own.
So maybe it's worth just mentioning, we're not really going over primary and secondary sources here, but basically remember a primary source is something like we are reading Hamlet by Shakespeare, that is our primary source. And then we have an essay by a prominent scholar on Shakespeare about Hamlet, and that's our secondary source. So you might find an argument in a secondary source that says something about Hamlet, and then you say, what do I think about that argument? Do I agree with it? Do I disagree with it? Do I partially agree, but I have something else to say? Do I want to refine their argument? So that's where argument comes in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The other way we see high school students using sources all the time is probably the way that comes most immediately to mind is pulling something out as an example, right? You say that such and such is going on in Hamlet, you pull out a piece of Hamlet to show that you're correct, right? So you use part of a source as an example when it helps you illustrate a point through interpretation or analysis. And while that's very typical, it's not always done most effectively through actually quoting the text. And so that's something that we're going to get into later to see how these examples actually come into your writing. We also just want to flag that, of course, there are many other ways to engage with sources. And as your writing gets more complex, especially as you go into college, you're going to use sources in a lot of different ways, including, providing some background context for a problem you're exploring, or a theoretical lens, what might be called a theoretical lens for interpreting a problem. And, that might be anything from, let's look at this, let's look at Jane Eyre from a feminist perspective, and now you're finding a source that talks about what feminism is, so that you can do that analysis. But we're just going to focus on argument and example tonight because those are the most common for high school papers. So Tania, why don't you tell us about argument?
I would love to. Okay, so what we have here is a sample sort of paper. We chose to work with a story that everyone knows, Snow White, and we found an interesting secondary source that has some commentary on it. So we're going to see what argument this paper by a writer is building. Okay, so I'll read through it. The tale of Snow White has been told many times, but the basic story stays the same. A beautiful young girl is threatened by a jealous stepmother and rescued by a handsome prince. The version of the story most people know today is Walt Disney's cartoon movie, but Disney borrowed the story from the Brothers Grimm. Most of Disney's fairy tale adaptations are considered lighter and more appropriate for kids than the Grimm's versions. However, Maria Tatar, expert on folklore and mythology, says that Disney's Snow White actually intensified the story's dark side, unquote, by keeping many of the bloody parts and placing extra focus on the evil queen. It's true that Disney's version of the story is dark for a kids' movie, but when compared to the Grimm's, it becomes clear that Disney's version is disturbing in different ways. So, what's happening here? we have an introductory paragraph that kind of leads down to a thesis. And we've identified this interesting opinion by this writer, Maria Tatar, who says that Disney's Snow White actually makes the story darker, which is interesting because it's Disney. And that's like, wow, really? Why would that be? So then we've come up with an argument, and that argument is yes, however. So yes, Disney's version of the story is kind of dark for a kid's movie. But, and here's where we're qualifying that argument. When compared to the Grimms, it becomes clear that Disney's version is disturbing in different ways. So we're going to be using our sources to get this argument across.
That's exactly right. And you can see how that conversation is happening in the refinement, right? Tatar is saying it's darker, and we're saying, well, yes, but maybe not as straightforwardly as what you're presenting.
Right. We have something to add.
Exactly.
A question for clarification, because I know sometimes for students, like, you know, how do you know in that first part that's highlighted, you know, which things to quote versus, let's say, in the second one where kind of some of the language is similar, but it's not being quoted. Like, you know, I think that I know that that's come up for students of mine who have gotten into trouble and gotten F's on papers, which has tanked their whole grade, which causes an issue in the college process, or even, you know, been charged with plagiarism at their school, and that causes an enormous issue in the college process because it's disciplinary action that has to be addressed and reported. So this is, like, from my perspective, it's always important, but it has ramifications if you don't really understand. And I think the question of, you know, how do you know when something like intensified the story's dark side? If you said it slightly differently, you know, like, how do you know when to quote, not, which is different than just citing, I guess. Maybe.
Right. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Believe it or not, we're going to go into this in some detail later. So I'm very glad that you already have that question.
Yeah.
So my instinct is to say we're going to get to it, but keep that question in your head. Does that work okay for you?
We can handle it later for sure.
Okay.
Great. Yeah. If you still have questions, yeah, later on, definitely bring that up again. But yeah, we hope we will be talking about that in some depth.
Mm-hmm.
So for now, you can see that we are taking a claim from a secondary source and using it to construct our own argument in response.
Right. So we have our ideas in conversation with the ideas of someone else.
Exactly.
And that's what we're trying to do in general in a paper like this.
And then the next way we most commonly find that students engage with sources is via example, right? So maybe I'll read this one and give Tania a break from reading. So to examine Tatar's claim, it's important to consider the differences between the Grimm and Disney versions of Snow White. The Grimms include scenes of cannibalism. The queen eats a liver and lungs that she thinks are Snow's. That's awful. And physical torture. The queen is forced to dance in burning shoes until she dies. It's misleading to claim that Disney's version keeps many of the bloody parts because there is nothing that extreme in the movie. The evil queen falls off a cliff. She isn't tortured to death. She orders the huntsman to kill Snow White, but she doesn't eat any supposedly human body parts. But these differences aren't enough to make the movie less dark, because Disney changes other parts of the Grimm fairy tale to make it more psychologically than physically horrifying. Okay, so there's quite a bit going on here. But think back to what we said examples are for, right? An example is used to illustrate a point. So our examples here are examples of differences, right? The Grimms have cannibalism and torture. Disney doesn't. These are our examples.
The bar is low.
What, sorry, say that again, Mary.
The bar is low.
The bar is low.
The bar is really low when it comes to some of these old fairy tales. They are really gory.
Oh, the Brothers Grimm are
They're grim.
Wild, grim, very grim. Yeah, so our examples here are being used to illustrate the differences between the Grimm version and the Disney version. And that allows our writer here to make a further point, to further refine their initial claim that what's more dark about the Disney version is something psychological. We'll probably read more about that in the next body paragraph if we had a next body paragraph, right? So it does seem like in some ways the Disney movie is less dark. It doesn't have all this cannibalism and torture, right? So there must be something else that we should be looking at to really assert that Disney's version is as upsetting or more so than Grimm's.
And if you're sitting there asking yourself, okay, but what about the citations? What about the sources? We're getting there. I promise we are.
That is actually going to be the very next thing we talk about. Writing with sources. So now that you know how to have a conversation with a source, right? How to think with a source, how do you actually get it into your writing? And a little later, we'll talk about when do you actually cite the source in your writing. One way to write with a source is to use it for a summary, right? So you might give a broad overview of a source when you're introducing it, just to briefly explain what it's about. We might give a summary like Tatar's work on Snow White covers not only the Snow White story, but 21 similar tales, right? That's a pretty broad summary. Paraphrase is where students really get tripped up.
Yeah.
This is where the problems occur.
Yeah, this
right
is
here.
This is where it all goes wrong.
Right. Here's the traffic jam that we're going to try to untangle for you.
Exactly. So paraphrasing is putting an idea in your own words. When and why do you do that? Well, you might use
why can't I just use the quotation every time?
Yeah. Believe it or not, sometimes you are going to be capable of writing a clearer sentence than your source text. This is especially true if you're dealing with something like very complex science writing or maybe highly theoretical history sources, or in my own discipline of philosophy, comes up a lot that I can say things more clearly than some of those philosophers could.
And in addition to that, if I can add, when we're thinking about high school writing, and it will apply to college writing too, but your teacher isn't just making you go through the paces of writing this paper because, for their own enjoyment. They're trying to teach you how to use your ideas and someone else's ideas. So basically, they want proof that you understood the thing you read. They want to know that you didn't just read the source and now you're going to quote the source, but we never really find out if you knew what it said, if you had any take on it. So when you paraphrase, it's also a way of saying to your teacher, here is what I understand this to mean. And that's good to do.
That's right. That's absolutely right. It's also just not always necessary to have the full quotation. Sometimes it doesn't matter how an author particularly worded an idea. Sometimes all you need is the idea. So feel free to put it in your own words. But just know that changing one or two words does not make something a paraphrase. That is
changing the order of a few words.
Right. You can't just change the syntax of a quote and now it's yours. It really is substantively different, and we will show you how.
Yep, that's right. That's right. I think that's where people get into trouble the most. And then finally, direct quotation, I think, is probably what comes to mind most immediately when people think about working with sources. Tania, you want to tell us about direct quotation?
Yeah, direct quotation is when you're just gonna literally pull the quote. Well, I guess it's not literal, but you're gonna pull the quote from the source and you're gonna slap it in to your essay with the quotation marks. And this, whenever your teacher is saying do a close reading, this is gonna be obviously for English classes and things like that. It's useful to have the direct quotation because then you can say, as you can see, the author uses the word, in our case, dark, as you'll see, or, you know, it's very important the way that the character phrases this. You can do the analysis of the quotation that's right in front of you. And that's a different way of using a source.
Yeah, exactly. So when there's something specific about the language or the grammar, the way a sentence is structured, then you want to use direct quotation because you want your readers to be able to see the very same thing that you're seeing and analyzing.
I'd also add, and this also comes up in college essay writing too, so often students will lean on direct quotations a bit. Because it like takes up space without you having to think, right? We all have been there. No secrets out there about that. And then also, sometimes students think that it is said better, or, oh, how can I improve upon this? But I see it even in some college essays where, you know, there's like this dialogue and other things where it's like, I don't want to hear like all the little bits. I want you to kind of get to it for me and move it along faster. And again, it tells it from your perspective. It brings it together more. So the actual quotations often really aren't as interesting as the way that you could say it. So you use it as Katie and Tania were saying, you use it when it's really important that they really hear every word, like the literal way that it's said exactly. But I often find that students tend to lean on them a bit much.
Totally agree. Also was totally guilty of that for a long time.
I'll admit it. Yep.
Yep.
From experience, you know, we've all done the same things that, you know, play with the margins, the font, you know.
Right. What if I used a block quote here? That would surely take up some space.
Right.
Yep.
Intonation helps, all of it. We've all done the same stuff.
Absolutely.
Oh,
go for it, Tania.
Yeah. So let's go into a little more depth about these three ways of using sources. So summary. So what's now in front of you on the screen is, you've seen this before in a previous slide, but we have greened the summary for you. So I'll just read it through. So the tale of Snow White has been told many times, but the basic story stays the same. Here's the summary. A beautiful young girl is threatened by a jealous stepmother and rescued by a handsome prince. There's no reason to have someone else's direct quotation of what Snow White is about. This is common knowledge, right? This is what is the general story of Snow White. And then we have the Grimms include scenes of cannibalism and physical torture. So maybe there isn't a source that specifically says that in that way, but we need to tell you that pretty directly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's tricky about the second example, and we chose it directly, explicitly for this reason, is that the second example we've pulled here includes both summary and paraphrase. So you're not going to be able to go to Grimm's fairy tales and find a statement to the effect that it includes cannibalism, but you can find examples of cannibalism and draw your own conclusion, right? So that's the summary, is for us to abstract from what the text actually says and say, oh, this is cannibalism and that's torture. But when you're pointing to those specific examples, you're paraphrasing. So these parenthetical remarks, the queen eats a liver and lungs that she thinks are snows, and the queen is forced to dance in burning shoes until she dies. These are paraphrases because you can look to the text and find the line of the text that says that information, right? So we've actually pulled those lines so that you can see how our version differs from the original.
Sorry, they're horrifying.
No, they are. We really should have.
Completely horrifying.
Um,
But here is what has been paraphrased.
yeah. So let's look at the degree of difference, right, between our version and the original. Grimm says, the cook had to boil them with salt, and the wicked woman ate them, supposing that she had eaten Snow White's lungs and liver. And we said the queen eats a liver and lungs that she thinks are Snow's. Our paraphrase works better in our sentence than the direct quotation would. The direct quotation is actually ambiguous for a while. You really don't know what's the them that's being boiled. What is she eating, right? Until the end of the sentence. So it's clearer for our purposes to reword this. And similarly, the queen is forced to dance in burning shoes until she dies. That's much more succinct than this statement that then they put whoever they are, right? Then they put a pair of iron shoes into burning coals. They were brought forth with tongs and placed before her. She was forced to step into the red hot shoes and dance until she fell down dead. In fact, this direct quote doesn't even say who the she is.
Yeah, who is she anyway?
Yeah.
And so we've clarified that in the paraphrase. The queen is forced to dance in burning shoes until she dies. We didn't need those direct quotations in our paper.
Exactly. Because what's important is the idea, the fact that these things happened,
right?
Not how they were described.
And these are great examples of how when you say it more efficiently, it's so much better. So often students in writing for school as well as in college essays feel that either fancier language or bigger words or more words somehow makes you sound more informed, and it typically does exactly the opposite. And so being able, I think the real hallmark of that shows that someone actually knows what they're talking about is their ability to do it succinctly and clearly. And so as the writer, whatever argument you're making or whatever story you're telling, that's what you want to do as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Since paraphrase is such a tricky item, we actually have 2 examples for you.
And this is different because in the previous slide, we were showing you something from the primary source, right? We're showing you quotations from the Grimm brothers, Snow White. This is an example of how you paraphrase a secondary source. So this is someone else's idea that we want to use and we want to give that person credit for, but we want to say it in our own words.
Right. So the example from our sample essay, Maria Tatar, expert on folklore and mythology, says that Disney's Snow White actually, quote, intensified the story's dark side, unquote, by keeping many of the bloody parts and placing extra focus on the evil queen. Now, when we saw this in Tatar, what she actually said is, quote, one could quickly counter that Disney, rather than lightening up the story, not only preserved much of the blood and gore, but intensified its dark side, giving the wicked queen more airtime than ever, end quote. So we do have the main ideas from Tatar, but again, using this whole quotation almost muddies the idea rather than clarifying it. She starts off by saying that she's countering some other idea. We don't need to worry about what that is. That's just going to take away from our focus, which is on her claim that the blood and gore are still there and the darkness is intensified in some way.
Right. And that doesn't mean that we're twisting something that Tatar said. You don't want to do that. But what we're saying is we don't need to tell you what her entire paper is about, which is very interesting, by the way. But you don't need that to understand the argument we are making in our paper.
That's right. That's right. It's a whole book. We don't need to walk you through
right.
every step.
Don't need the whole thing. Yeah.
Exactly. And so in our previous example of paraphrase from the Grimms, we had summary and paraphrase side by side. And here we've got direct quotation and paraphrase side by side. And so I think these examples are also helpful for reminding you that these are flexible tools. These do not have to be rigidly separated and serve extremely different purposes. Once you get comfortable knowing why you're using a source, and the variety of ways in which sources can be used, it's easy to fluidly move in and out of these modes of engagement.
And the word fluid is really important there, because that's actually what one of the things that does create flow in a paper where you're using sources is, you can imagine what if you did all direct quotation, it would just be like jammed up with quotations and it would not be smooth. But you can see how what we've done with the paraphrase just creates a smoother sentence also.
Absolutely. So then why did we quote this? Back to Bari's question.
Why is there any direct quotation in the first place?
Yeah, intensified the story's dark side. Why did we quote this? That was the question. Okay, so let's focus on the part we did directly quote now. Maria Tatar, expert on folklore and mythology, says that Disney Snow White actually, quote, intensified the story's dark side, end quote, by keeping many of the bloody parts and placing extra focus on the evil queen. It's true that Disney's version of the story is, quote, dark, end quote, for a kid's movie. But when compared to the Grimms, it becomes clear that Disney's version is disturbing in different ways.
Okay, so what is the word that we care so much about in this quotation? It's dark. And Katie and I actually had an interesting conversation about this, because you have to ask yourself, what would happen if we just paraphrase that too? Mm-hmm. We end up adding to it when we say Disney's version is disturbing in different ways, but we're interested in the fact that Tatar is using this word, dark, mm-hmm. to describe what's going on, because we have our own idea of what dark means.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think the argument of this essay hinges on unpacking her use of that word, right? What's dark about Disney's version and Grimm's version turns out to be different. That's the claim of our sample essay. And so it's really digging into what that term means and what, in what ways is Snow White dark? That's such a central question that it's worth using the direct quotation to flag that that's what you're investigating.
I'm sure many of the students who are listening have, which is, if you were to take out that quote, intensify the story's dark side, and if you said, Maria Tatar, blah, 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 says that Disney Snow White actually, says, kind of just change it a little bit. I had it in my head before I started talking, but hold on, I don't know who says that Disney Snow White actually is more just, I'm saying disturbing, or whatever. I think we can use the word disturbing. Is more disturbing, or you change intensified to actually increased the scary parts. And obviously that's not what you would say if you were writing for school, but you know what I mean? Kind of just ever so slightly, putting in something else for intensified and changing out the word like dark. Mm-hmm. Then what happens and what is that?
Yeah, this is all part of the conversation Tania and I actually had in preparing.
Right. It's like, is it important? And that's part of the thinking with sources. It's like, can I just replace this with the word scary, the word frightening, the word disturbing, something else? We decided, no, this is actually, the word dark is important because it is what our argument, we need her exact version of what she thinks that means for us.
But let's just say that was lost on you as a student, right? Let's just say that, and you didn't think that dark was a particularly important word in particular, and you just kind of changed intensified to a different word that meant the same thing, and same thing with dark. You know, you kind of used another word in its place. You still cite, and I think this gets back to the idea of syntax that you guys mentioned earlier. You know, that there are different ways that one can plagiarize, and whether unintentionally often, as I've seen with my students.
Oh, so you mean if you just replace dark, you said intensify the story's scary side or something.
Or and took away and change intensified. It increased, you know, the scary side, whatever.
Then I think that what it ends up being is where we said you can't just change one or two words and call it a paraphrase. Katie?
Yeah, I agree. I think, I mean, I think either way, whether it's a good paraphrase or a bad paraphrase, you would need to cite the source.
Right, you definitely need to cite it.
The idea did not come from you, but it's misleading to change one or two words and sort of claim the phrasing as your own.
I think that's where a lot of students have gotten into trouble, at least in my experience, is that they say that, well, those are my words. I was kind of thinking the same way that this was written. And I think whenever there's a question of that, if you can really kind of show the same syntax, the same structure of the sentence, and just some words are changed, that even if you think it seems like a fairly generic kind of sentence, that it's best to do the citation. Because whether it's your teacher who sees it and recognizes it, or it's a computer program that they're running everything through that's going to really pick up on every, thing, you don't want to cite every single sentence in a paper, but, if there's ever that doubt, certainly better to cite than not.
Well, and also to Tania's point earlier, part of the beauty of paraphrase is being able to show that you really understand something in a deep way. And if all you've done is found a synonym for a word or two, that doesn't really show a deep understanding of what the sentence is trying to convey. It shows maybe, that you're adept with a thesaurus, which is not the same thing. So I think if you're at the point where you're just tinkering with one or two words, better to just use the quotation.
Yeah, just quote it.
Yeah, that's right. Just quote it. All right. So let's dive into the question of when to cite and when not to cite. So as I was sort of just alluding to, in-text citations should always be used with paraphrase, right? If this is somebody else's idea, think about citing ideas more than you're citing words, right? And there are a couple of reasons for this. I think in high school, I really had it hammered into me that the idea is about giving credit to someone else's ideas. And certainly you want to do that. You do not want to claim somebody else's ideas as your own. That's dishonest. But, Tania reminded me, as we were talking about this webinar, that in our sort of professional lives and in our, even in college, that's not all that citations are doing. Citations are really inviting other people into the conversation that you're having. So in this sample paper, our paper writer is having a conversation with Maria Tatar and Disney and the Brothers Grimm, and by telling us where these quotations are coming from in Tatar, or where these ideas are coming from in Tatar, or where this scene is in Disney, I can now go look for myself. I can go read Tatar and ask myself, well, is that really a fair characterization of her argument? Is that really what she's saying? Or does Disney really not have any torture? I can jump in. And so that's much more how citations work in academia, in college and beyond. So always for paraphrase and direct quotation, and mostly for summary, right?
Right.
So if you're summarizing a specific source, right, like that brief summary I gave of Maria Tatar's, book covers 21 stories that are similar to Snow White. That's a very specific book you're talking about. You should tell us where we can find it and when it was published and all of those things, right? What you don't need to cite is what my high school teachers, I don't know if they still call it this, but my high school teachers always called it common knowledge, right? And that's things like the summary of the story of Snow White. We were pointing out that the Snow White story has many different versions. So there's no one version of the story that we're pointing to for the summary. Many stories share this overall structure. So if there's something that you're not getting from a particular source, you probably do not need to cite it. Because what would you cite? Really, that's the question, is what would you cite?
You'd have to cite like every version of Snow White ever written, which is not really practical.
Yeah, that's not necessary.
Right.
It's really not.
Knowing now that there are so many versions, it makes me feel better that I had no recollection of a couple of things that you guys had mentioned.
Yeah, I will say I am much more familiar now with the Snow White story than I was before.
Yeah, it's like we had a crash course in it while preparing this webinar. Like, oh God, really?
I thought of her as Snow. I just always thought of her as Snow White. So you
Right.
referring to her as Snow is also it's opened up a whole new way of thinking.
Oh, it's a whole thing. So the examples that we've been giving so far have all been in-text citations, those parenthetical citations you use in your writing, but it's also important to include what are called the full citations of sources, where you include the author, the title, when it was published, things like that. Whether that's in a footnote at the bottom of the page or in a works cited section at the end of your paper, it's important to tell your readers where you can find the source that you're using. And so it would be wrong of us to have used all these sources without providing a works cited page. So we have done so. And you can see that this includes much more information than the in-text citations. There are many different styles for both in-text citation and works cited pages, but in general, the information you want, right? Who wrote it? What did they write? When did they write it? And so we've got ours here, and we have some tips for navigating citation styles as well.
Yeah. So, first of all, usually, almost always, and if they don't ask them, your teacher will tell you what convention they want you to use, what style. We say here usually APA for scientific papers and MLA for the humanities. If you don't know what those are, that's okay. You may not have needed to know yet. But there are just specific ways of formatting, and they have slightly different information that they include. As Katie was reminding me earlier, with scientific papers, we care more about when did this person write this? Because we want to make sure the priority is kind of like, is this research up to date? You don't want to be citing something and say like, this is from 1831, and you're like, ugh, seems kind of like there could have been a more recent source. With the humanities, it's more what scholarly work is this from, and not as much emphasis on when was it written. We want to know who wrote it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We want to know who we're in conversation with. The second tip here is about brackets. So you may have noticed that there were brackets in our direct quotation. Intensified the story's dark side. So the actual quotation, just purely as it was in the source, was something like intensified its dark side, because there was an earlier part of the sentence that talked about the story. And so if we were to just quote it with intensified its dark side, then we're going to end up doing a bunch of gymnastics in our sentence to try to put the words the story somewhere. So what we can do here is just use brackets and say the stories in place of its. That's just our way of signaling to the person reading this, we are just giving you, we're just filling this in a way that now the grammar is going to make sense with the quotation.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. It can be important to change words of a quotation if you have a tense change, from past to present, or like we did, it's not clear exactly what the quotation's talking about. And
right, maybe you need to put someone's name in the brackets instead of a pronoun.
Exactly. And all of this is fair game, but what the brackets do is the brackets are that honest moment of saying, this part's mine.
Right, I did that.
Yeah, exactly.
I did that there.
So another way to change a direct quotation is to cut some of it out, right? Not to change things, but to cut it down. And you can do this with an ellipsis, which is those 3 dots, right? That means something's missing. So here's an example from Tatar. I happen to find a very long sentence on page 5 that talked about all the different elements of the Snow White story and all kinds of sets of questions that the story raises. But maybe I don't need all of that. Maybe I'm going to write a paper about mothers and daughters. And so all I need from her is the idea that the Snow White story challenges us to ask questions about mothers and daughters. Right? That's perfectly fair. We just might not need all of the other questions that she's pointing out. So you can also, I know for me in high school, I would have been horrified to do that, because now I've lost all the wonderful
Now you don't have the
words.
leg.
Yeah, exactly. Now I've lost all those extra words that were going to get me to my page count. But no, really, this is better. Extra information is distracting from your main point, and this really clarifies it. Tania, you want to?
Oh, sure. Yeah, the last thing is kind of the opposite of the brackets. So if you are directly quoting something and there is an error in it, there is a handy way of saying that's not my mistake. So if there is a mistake in your source text, you can signal that you know it's wrong by using in brackets sick, as in they made their sick beds, because it should be their possessive, but we have their like over there. So basically sick is Latin for, it's basically Latin for that's how they wrote it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I was saying it's Latin for it wasn't me.
That's right.
Me. So with the brackets, you're basically signaling this was my phrase. And with sick, you're basically saying that wasn't me. I didn't do that.
That's right. That's exactly right. So those are some of our tips and tricks. For more on citation styles and guidelines and how you use things like ellipses and sick, there are great online resources. One that happens to be my favorite is the online writing lab at Purdue University. I'll put that in the.
At some point, we're gonna have to get like a sponsorship from them.
I know they are.
We love them, and we will always recommend them.
They are the absolute best, and that'll of course go out in the in the email summary after the webinar. But if you have additional questions sort of related to this, they're a wonderful free resource. So this has been Sourcery 101.
Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope it was more than you expected.
to everybody. And if you are, if I don't know if you attended our prior webinar, but whether or not you did, we also, just to announce, we're having this summer, we have 4 sessions, and we're having a summer small group writing program. So they're 3 weeks long, 4 different start dates, 2 in July, 2 in August, and they're small groups. You'll be working with our writing specialists to, to kind of really learn how to develop an argument and write a coherent and cohesive paper that you can then take what you learn and transfer it to your writing for school or for college. So if you want more information, definitely reach out. You can go to our website, to our Contact Us page, expertadmissions.com, or shoot us an email directly at admin@expertadmissions.com. Katie, if you maybe say a couple more words. I know I'm speaking kind of broadly, but you might be able to say a little bit more, just if anyone's interested. But it's a short program that you might be able to fit in between some of the other things that you're doing. And we have some evening start times as well as daytime ones.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty good summary. The idea is that it should be a series of workshops that really build on each other, so that you are slowly building up the skills that you need to fully execute a paper from start to finish, from initial research and brainstorming to completed draft and some revisions. So it should be a pretty neat little boot camp, I think. Don't let that intimidate you. We're not right now.
Always have fun with it. Yeah. So, but yes, thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to follow up, and remember to cite your sources.
There we go.
Thanks, everybody.